For many years, Pierre-Emerick Aubameyang lived in a state few could truly understand, where each day felt like a fragile balance between two completely different selves, one celebrated by the entire world and one quietly battling unseen emptiness within. There were evenings when, after scoring and becoming the focal point of tens of thousands of fans, he returned to a heavy silence where the cheers faded and only unshakable thoughts remained. He became used to smiling when cameras turned toward him, used to showing the confidence people expected. But deep inside, there was always a feeling that he had to constantly prove himself, that if he slowed down even slightly, everything could collapse. Growing up between multiple cultures, carrying family expectations and the pressure of elite football meant he never truly felt he belonged anywhere. And that sense of disconnection became the force pushing him forward, even when he was not sure where he was running. His will did not come from perfection, but from the fear of being left behind, from being doubted, from being seen as not good enough, and from a quiet desire that one day he would no longer have to live two lives at once. But it was precisely that inner conflict that shaped one of the most memorable careers in modern football. Aubameyang scored more than 140 goals for Borussia Dortmund, won the Bundesliga Golden Boot in the 2016-2017 season, and was named African Player of the Year in 2015, a milestone that placed him among the world's top stars. After moving to Arsenal, he continued to prove his value by winning the Premier League Golden Boot in the 2018-2019 season, while playing a decisive role in the club's FA Cup triumph in 2020 with crucial goals in both the semi-final and the final. He also became captain, a symbol of hope for the team during difficult times. At the international level, Aubameyang became the all-time leading scorer for Gabon, bringing pride to a nation with limited opportunities to shine on the global football stage. Despite many ups and downs, the numbers, titles, and moments he left on the pitch stand as clear proof that, despite all his inner struggles, he did not just survive, but reach the top in his own way. Before continuing into the journey behind that smile, press like and leave a heart as a quiet way to acknowledge a person who had to be stronger than the world ever saw. And do not forget to subscribe, because the story will take you to where all the glory began and where the first cracks appeared. The childhood of Pierre-Emerick Aubameyang was not marked by a fixed address or stable memories lasting long enough to become a foundation, but by a series of departures before he could truly stay, a chain of journeys between France, Italy, and Spain, where each city was only a brief stop in a constantly moving life. Born in Laval, but raised in a rhythm tied to his father's football career, he quickly understood that home was not a place, but a shifting idea that changed with every move. There were days he woke up in a new room, hearing unfamiliar sounds outside the window, trying to adapt to a language he had not understood the day before, and learning to smile at faces he would not see again just months later. Change came so fast that emotions could not keep up. And gradually, he learned not to hold on to anything for too long, because everything would eventually leave just as it had arrived. His family was a football family, where conversations about matches, tactics, opportunities, and failure were always present, where his father was not only a guide, but also a figure he had to look up to, but that also allowed pressure to seep into every moment of childhood. Love existed, but not in a gentle and stable form, instead carrying silent expectations like an unseen current that was always there. While others grew up in familiar environments and built lasting relationships, Aubameyang grew up in constant interruption, where every connection was fragile, where starting over became so normal it lost its meaning. He had no single street to remember, no corner of a house to return to in memory, only fragments of many places pieced together into an incomplete childhood. There were afternoons when sunlight fell on small pitches where he played with other children, and he felt closer to something real than anywhere else. On the field, everything became simple, no questions about where he came from, no awkwardness explaining himself in multiple languages, just the ball in his feet, knowing what to do. When he ran, he was no longer a child constantly adapting to a changing world, but someone with direction, someone in control of each step. Those first touches were not about fame, but about rare moments of peace, where he could forget the sense of displacement that had followed him from early on. Yet even as he found certainty in football, the rest of life remained unstable. Each move meant starting over again, making friends again, understanding a new environment, finding a place to stand. Friends became memories, habits were left behind, and the feeling of temporary became inseparable. There were moments he wondered whether he was truly living a life or just passing through different versions of it, never staying long enough anywhere to belong. In that constant motion, football became the only unbroken thread, the only thing that remained across every city, language, and phase of his life. Wherever he went, the pitch was a place he could return to, a place that did not ask him to explain who he was, where everything was decided by what he did with the ball, not by his past or background. Perhaps that is why he held on to football, not just as a path, but as a way to exist, a way to create continuity in a life full of interruptions. Yet, the feeling of not belonging never truly disappeared. It only changed shape and sank deeper over time. Outwardly, he learned to be confident, to adapt faster, to show he was unaffected by constant change. But inside, he was still a child who never had enough time to feel stability. Two versions of himself became clearer, one moving forward strong and decisive, and one staying behind, quietly observing, carrying unanswered questions about identity and belonging. As life pushed him further and faster, those two selves did not disappear, but grew more distant, coexisting in a journey he himself never fully understood. In his memory, the figure of his father was not just family, but a path laid out early, one he had little choice but to follow. His father, a former professional footballer, knew the sport was not just a game, but a harsh world where only the strong survive. And so his love was not simply gentle care, but guidance, pressure, and sometimes unspoken demands heavy enough for a child to feel. From a young age, Aubameyang became used to hearing about standards, effort, and never stopping, as if his life had already been placed on a track he had to follow, whether he fully understood it or not. In early training sessions, while other children saw football as fun, he felt something different. A quiet pressure turning every touch into a test, a step forward or backward on an expected path. His father stood there, not always needing to say much, but his presence alone made everything feel significant beyond the moment. Love existed, but not gently, more like a powerful current carrying responsibility and expectation, making him understand that success was not a choice, but a necessity. Growing up in such an environment, Aubameyang learned to be strong early, not because he did not feel fear, but because he had little space to show weakness. He built an outer shell, a confident, decisive figure always moving forward, as if nothing could hold him back. But beneath it was a difficult fear that one day he might not meet expectations, that everything he tried might still not be enough. It was not sudden, but grew over time, shaping decisions, steps, preventing him from ever feeling fully secure in what he achieved. There were moments he realized he was not just playing for himself, but for what had been placed on him early, for not disappointing the one who guided him. That made success heavier. Not just joy, but confirmation. He was still on the right path, had not lost something important. But mistakes also grew heavier. Not just imperfections, but signs he might not be good enough. Family, in his case, was not an escape from pressure, but where pressure was formed, even with good intentions. His father wanted a secure future for him, wanted him to avoid hardships he had faced, but that created a burden Aubameyang carried through his growth. He learned not only to fight on the pitch, but against himself, against thoughts of needing to be better, faster, stronger, no matter what he achieved. Gradually, the two selves became clearer than ever. one stepping into the world with confidence, speed, drawing attention, and one remaining behind, questioning whether it was ever enough. He could score, win, be admired, but deep inside, the question of his worth remained unanswered. From that, a cycle formed, pushing him forward not just to achieve more, but to avoid confronting the fear that stopping would make everything meaningless. When he arrived at AC Milan, he carried everything shaped by childhood and expectations, believing this would be where his efforts were recognized, where the path became clearer. But reality did not match his imagination. Among established stars, he was not central, not a priority, but a small part of a demanding system where opportunities were scarce. Training sessions passed. Matches came and went with him watching from the outside, feeling the gap between dream and reality. Then came loans, not as opportunities, but as moves without clear destination, from Dijon to Lille OSC, then AS Monaco and AS Saint-Étienne. Each place a new beginning, new environment, new team, where he had to restart everything before securing anything. Seasons passed without continuity, without belonging, only suitcases packed and unpacked, unfamiliar locker rooms, evaluating eyes from those who did not know him. In such a system, the feeling of being left behind was gradual, not sudden. He was not clearly rejected, but never firmly kept. He existed in between, not bad enough to be discarded, not important enough to be irreplaceable, creating an uncomfortable void, a suspended state he lived in for years, where every appearance carried pressure to prove something, but without enough time to truly do so. There were nights alone in unfamiliar rooms when he wondered whether everything he was doing led anywhere or was just repeating cycles of trying and restarting. Those questions were never spoken, but grew with each season without answers. His self-belief, once built on expectations and strong will, began to show cracks. Not enough to collapse immediately, but enough to make everything feel uncertain. In rare chances to play, he tried to do everything faster, stronger, as if he had only minutes to prove he deserved to stay. But that urgency sometimes prevented him from being himself. Football, once stability, became fragile, dependent on decisions beyond his control, making him realize talent was not always enough. That survival itself was a constant battle. Gradually, his two selves separated further. One still confident on the field, showing strength, and another quietly facing growing doubt, feeling lost in a phase with no clear end. He did not stop, did not give up, but was no longer sure he was moving closer to anything. In those silent years, something formed, not failure, but fear that if it continued, he might disappear in a world where talent is replaced faster than remembered. Finally, when AS Saint-Étienne gave him more than scattered minutes, something began to change, not dramatically, but slowly and clearly enough for him to feel. For the first time in years, he stepped onto the field not as someone with only minutes to prove himself, but with time to breathe, feel the rhythm, rediscover instinct interrupted by instability. Goals began to come, not all at once, but gradually. As if piecing himself back together, fans began calling his name. Media mentioned him more, and a name once quiet gained a place in a team needing stability. But with attention came pressure to maintain it. Each goal became not just joy, but a reminder to continue, not slow down, or everything could disappear as quickly as it came. He was no longer forgotten, but not secure. Media attention, fan expectations, team trust formed a cycle he lived in daily, where every move was watched. There were matches he scored and was praised, but relief did not last, as thoughts turned to the next game, whether he could repeat it. Success, once a goal, did not bring peace, but a new, subtler pressure. He no longer feared being forgotten, but losing what he gained, returning to starting over. Training became heavier, not physically but mentally, as his mind never rested. He set higher standards, remembering what it felt like to not be good enough. missed shots and imperfect play stayed longer, forming small accumulating scars. Outwardly, he progressed, scored, was recognized, but inside, part of him remained in earlier years, where everything could collapse. The hardest part was not failure, but being unable to fully enjoy success. Others saw a rising player, but he felt a gap between reality and emotion. Joy existed, but always with a thin layer of anxiety, like a shadow. Hope, once motivation, became a source of pain. Because having something to lose made fear stronger, his two selves continued in parallel, but further apart. One confident, scoring, advancing, and the other looking back, preparing for everything to reset. He did not show it, because the world only saw the field, where he succeeded. But in unseen moments, he felt everything was temporary, that success was not truly his, but something he held on to daily, and in what seemed like the start of his rise, he realized the path ahead would not just be goals, but a quiet battle with the fear of losing everything he had just gained. When Borussia Dortmund appeared like an open door, while everything was still fragile, Aubameyang entered not just as a new signing, but as someone trying to hold on to the only thing taking shape after years of drifting. From the first matches, his speed tore through defenses, his runs carrying a long-held explosive energy. Goals came faster, and for the first time, he did not wait for chances, but became the center, the player teammates relied on. From a forgotten loanee, he became one of Europe's most feared strikers, capable of changing games in a moment. The world noticed him in a new way. Numbers, goals, awards appeared, and his name became associated with danger. He scored decisive goals, moments that lifted stadiums where all eyes followed him. His speed became a symbol, setting him apart. From the Bundesliga, he stepped into European spotlight, where every match was watched, every goal remembered. But as the spotlight grew stronger, what lay behind it became clearer, though not everyone noticed. His life changed quickly, from focusing only on football to facing fame and its temptations. Attention beyond the pitch, travel, events, nights beyond rest and preparation expanded into a life he had not known. He was no longer a player proving himself minute by minute, but a star with easier access to everything. In that change, problems began, not suddenly, but as small cracks spreading. Lateness, incomplete training sessions, decisions conflicting with team discipline. Not all at once, but enough to form a pattern. To others, it might seem like a star living his status. But for him, it was imbalance he could not control. He still scored, remained a hero, but off the field, life moved differently. Faster, more complex, harder to manage. There were days he woke unsure where he stood in everything, between matches, flights, appearances, and fewer private moments. Success became something to maintain, requiring more than he expected. He had to perform and live up to an image, and in doing so, lost control of other parts of life. His two selves began to collide. One still ran, scored, celebrated, symbolizing speed and explosion, while the other faced consequences of an uncontrollable life. His brilliance remained, but no longer masked what was forming. He could be fastest on the field, but off it, everything moved at a speed he could not stop. What made it more complex was that he was still at the top, still scoring, still praised, so no one saw that behind numbers and titles, part of him was losing direction. Success continued, but stability did not. And in that gap, he moved forward, faster, stronger, but further from control. When he reached the stage where his name was mentioned among Europe's top strikers, everything seemed like the point he had pursued, where goals became habit, each match carrying expectation. The Golden Boot came as confirmation. A milestone proving years of uncertainty led to something tangible. Fans cheered. Media praised him as a symbol of speed and efficiency. Everything reflected a player at his peak. Stadiums filled with cheers, lights shining, millions watching his every move, creating an image of completeness. Goals continued, decisive ones, maintaining his status among top names. Praise came from fans and experts alike. Even former doubters acknowledged his rise. Everything indicated success, that he had reached a place few could. But when the spotlight faded, another reality appeared, not visible to others but familiar to him. Nights after matches did not always feel complete, as silence brought back thoughts. He could score and be praised, but alone, the feeling did not last, as if it did not reach something inside. Luxury hotels, constant travel, bright cities did not bring closeness, sometimes highlighting distance. There were moments he stood among teammates and fans yet felt separate, as if observing from outside. No one saw the rest of him, no one asked about what was not on the field, and he did not speak. In a world measuring success by goals and titles, unquantifiable things had no place. He kept everything inside, continued playing, scoring, smiling as expected. But the further he went, the clearer the gap between his two selves. One continued receiving praise, maintaining performance, while the other grew tired of maintaining that image. Success did not disappear, but did not bring relief. Each title raised standards, forcing him to keep running without a clear end. In rare moments, he realized he had achieved almost everything a player could dream of. Yet something remained unfulfilled. Not titles or recognition, but an indescribable feeling, as if everything touched only the surface while something deeper remained out of reach. He did not speak of it, because it was hard to explain emptiness when everything outside showed the opposite. And so he continued, with the world seeing a player at the top, while he felt another journey unfolding within. Goals, titles, cheers remained, but were no longer answers to everything, just one part of a story, the visible part, while the rest remained in silence, where he faced questions alone. The fracture did not come suddenly, but grew through small details, as differences between him and Borussia Dortmund's staff could no longer be hidden by goals. It started with lateness, misaligned schedules, then became personal decisions disrupting team order. In a controlled environment, any deviation became significant, especially when coming from the team's center. He still scored, but off the field, distance formed, not just with the coach, but with the system itself. Being left out of lineups became messages, internal suspensions set boundaries. Public criticism followed. Media shifted from praising goals to questioning attitude and professionalism. Headlines changed, his image developed cracks. He was no longer just a hero, but a controversial figure. For him, it was hard to accept, as he still saw himself as someone who contributed and delivered. The difference between perception and self-created distance he did not know how to close. On-field and off-field realities diverged, and maintaining performance increased tension. Comfort disappeared, trust weakened. Everything grew heavier. In that context, leaving became inevitable, not a simple choice but a result of accumulation. His departure from Borussia Dortmund was not smooth, but tense. Both sides understanding the limit was reached. There was no complete farewell, no peaceful closure, just the end of an important chapter that could no longer continue. He left with goals and memories, but also unresolved issues. The sense of loss was not just leaving a club, but leaving a place that shaped his best version. At Dortmund, he developed not only professionally, but personally. Leaving meant losing a part of himself he was unsure he would find again. Memories remained, but became past, no longer part of his present. This transition did not bring immediate relief, but created a new void, where he had to start again while carrying unfinished things. His two selves grew even more distant, one moving forward, seeking new opportunities, the other remaining with what had happened, questioning whether things could have been different. And in that moment of departure, though unspoken, he understood he was not just entering a new chapter, but leaving behind a place that once made him feel he truly belonged, even if only for a short time. Leaving behind the tense days, Pierre-Emerick Aubameyang stepped into a new environment with a feeling that was both familiar and unfamiliar. Familiar in that he had to start over again, unfamiliar in that this time he was no longer a name that needed to prove himself, but an answer others were waiting for. When he arrived at Arsenal, he carried not only the baggage of goals, but also the expectations of a team in need of a foundation after years of instability. Fans looked at him as the solution to problems that had lasted too long, as someone who could change the course, who could bring back the belief they had gradually lost. From his very first matches, he did not make them wait long. The familiar bursts of speed, the clinical finishes, the goals that came at the moments the team needed most quickly made him the center of attention. The Emirates began to echo his name, not just as a new player, but as the hero they had been searching for. The numbers increased with each match, each season, and with them came the belief that he could do even more, that he was not just part of the team, but the one who could lift the entire group. In a period when the team faced many difficulties, from inconsistent form to constant changes, his presence became a rare bright spot. Each goal did not just bring 3 points, but also the feeling that everything could still be saved, that there was still a reason to believe. He did not just score goals, but scored ones with greater meaning, moments when the entire stadium seemed to come alive again, where fans found hope at a time when hope was scarce. In that context, being given the captain's armband was not a surprise, but a natural next step in the role he had gradually taken on. From someone who came to score, he became someone who had to lead, not only through goals, but through presence, through how he stood on the field, through how he reacted in difficult moments. That responsibility was not spoken aloud, but was clear in every match, every look, every expectation placed on his shoulders. He not only had to perform well, but also had to be the one who kept the team from collapsing, the one teammates could look to when things became difficult. But along with that trust came a weight that was not always visible. Being captain was not just a title, but a role that demanded more than what happened on the field. He had to balance maintaining his individual form and carrying the collective between preserving the image of a star and becoming a leader. Matches were no longer just opportunities to score, but tests of his ability to handle pressure, of whether he could keep the team's spirit intact. On the outside, his image continued to be built as a hero, a symbol of hope, a player who could change a game at any moment. The media spoke of him as one of the few bright spots. Fans placed their faith in him more than anyone else in the squad. But behind all of that, another reality existed, where he had to face the fact that those expectations never stopped, only grew larger. Each goal did not reduce the pressure, but only increased the demand to continue, to maintain, to never decline. The two sides of him once again had to exist together in a tighter space. One stepped onto the field with confidence, with the role of captain, with the responsibility of a hero, while the other carried the weight of all of it, keeping everything from breaking under pressure. He could score, bring victories, become a symbol in others' eyes, but inside, he was still the person who had once doubted himself, feared losing everything. And now that fear did not disappear. It only changed form. Perhaps what made this period complex was not what happened on the field, but what happened inside him. Success came, recognition came, a bigger role came, but along with it was the feeling that he no longer had much room to make mistakes, no longer had many chances to stop. Everything kept moving forward, and he kept following, not because he did not want to stop, but because he was not sure what would happen if he did. And in that journey, the image of the hero continued to be built, day by day, match by match, not only from talent, but from the pressure he carried. What began as an honor gradually turned into a weight pressing down on every step of Pierre-Emerick Aubameyang, as the role of captain was no longer just an armband, but something present in every decision, every glance, every moment he appeared on the field. He still played with the same speed, the same instinct for goals, But beneath that familiar surface was a different rhythm, heavier, slower, as if every movement carried more than others could see. Responsibility did not stop at scoring, but extended to maintaining the team's spirit, being a foundation in moments when even he was not sure he was steady enough. And that made every match no longer just a sporting contest, but an ongoing test, where he had to constantly prove he was still strong enough to hold that position. The fatigue did not come from a single match, but accumulated over seasons, through constant travel, through pressure that never stopped. There were days he stepped onto the field, not with excitement, but with the feeling of having to complete a task, to keep everything from slipping out of control. His body still responded, but his mind began to slow. Reactions were no longer as sharp, and small gaps began to appear in moments he once handled instinctively. Touches were no longer perfect, finishes slightly less precise, decisions just a fraction slower. None of it enough to create a clear failure, but enough to change the sense of stability he once maintained. As his form began to fluctuate, what had once been strengths became things more closely scrutinized. People no longer looked only at goals, but at matches where he did not score, missed chances, moments when he no longer made a difference. The media tone shifted, from praise to questions, from belief to doubt, and in an environment where everything was judged weekly, match by match. That shift was never gentle. He was still captain, still leading, but the eyes around him were no longer the same, creating a different kind of pressure, hard to define but impossible to ignore. Small mistakes began to appear more often, not because he did not try, but because he was trying in a state that was no longer balanced. There were matches he ran more, tried more, but the effectiveness was no longer the same, making everything heavier, like a cycle he could not escape. He realized he could no longer rely entirely on instinct, that every action required more thought, and that took away the naturalness that had once been his greatest weapon. In moments no one saw, the internal struggle became clearer than ever. One part of him wanted to continue, to prove this was temporary, that he was still the one who could make a difference, while another part began to feel exhausted, not because his body could not endure, but because his mind was no longer light enough to continue as before. He could not stop, could not admit he was struggling because his role did not allow it. As captain, he had to stand firm, be the one others relied on, even when he himself needed support. The two sides within him no longer simply coexisted, but began to pull against each other, one pushing him forward to maintain the image, the responsibility, the position, while the other slowed down, carrying fatigue and unanswered questions. He stepped onto the field with a familiar smile, with the focus people expected. But inside, things were no longer that simple. Every match became an effort to keep everything from breaking, to make sure no one realized how much he was straining. And perhaps the hardest part was not the decline in form, but the inability to explain that feeling to anyone. From the outside, he was still a top player, still had moments of brilliance, still someone the team needed. But inside, the balance had begun to fade. Success was still there, but no longer brought relief, only highlighted the gap between what others saw and what he actually experienced. And within that gap, Aubameyang kept moving, not because he did not want to stop, but because he did not know any other way to keep everything from collapsing completely. Small cracks became more visible as disciplinary issues were no longer isolated incidents, but repeated patterns. And for Pierre-Emerick Aubameyang, it was not just a personal issue, but something that directly shook Arsenal's trust in the very person once seen as a foundation. It started with late returns, decisions that went against team rules. But in an environment where every detail is held to the highest standard, those things accumulated into something no one could ignore. He no longer faced only performance pressure, but also the changing muckloak, lock, fills, teammates, and those who once fully trusted him. Trust, once cracked, does not disappear immediately, but it is no longer whole. Conversations became more tense, decisions more decisive, and the unavoidable moment came when the captain's armband, symbol of trust and responsibility, was taken from his arm. It was not just losing a title, but an acknowledgement that his place within the group had changed, that he was no longer the one the team could rely on in the same way. Along with that, being left out of the squad was no longer temporary, but became a prolonged state where he no longer stepped onto the field, no longer took part in matches where he had once been central. From a hero full of expectations, he became an absence, a gap others had to fill. The locker room, once a space where he had a voice, where he led, became unfamiliar. Not because he was not physically there, but because his role no longer existed. Conversations happened without him. Decisions were made without his involvement, and the sense of separation became clearer than ever. There was no explosive moment, no single event marking collapse, but everything unfolded quietly, step by step, day by day. He no longer appeared in lineups, was no longer mentioned as a key figure, and gradually, his absence became normal. That may have been harder to accept than any public criticism, because it carried no direct confrontation, only a slow disappearance from a place he once held. When the time to leave came, it did not come with emotional farewells or celebrated moments, but quietly, as if everything had ended long before. He left Arsenal not as a hero completing a mission, but as a chapter closing without a clear conclusion. The goals, contributions, moments he once brought did not disappear, but they were no longer the most talked about. Instead came questions, doubts, different ways of seeing him. His reputation, built over years, began to change in ways he could not control. There was no complete explanation, no full story told, only fragments pieced together by others. He did not speak much, did not try to explain everything, and that silence widened the gap between him and the public. People began to see him not just as a player, but as a question without an answer. An image no longer as clear as before. In all of this, perhaps the hardest part was not losing position or reputation, but facing himself when everything was no longer the same. He could no longer rely on goals to hide problems, no longer use success to keep things balanced. The two sides within him, once hidden by the lights of the field, now became clearer in the silence. One still wanted to believe things could change, that this was temporary, while the other had to accept that some things could not be reversed. And in that quiet, without cheers, without pressure to score, he faced a reality he had long avoided, that his journey was not just about success, but also loss, mistakes, and moments beyond his control. There was no clear ending, no simple answer, only a person standing between what had been and what lay ahead, trying to understand where he stood. After a long period of silence, when everything seemed to slow enough for him to breathe, Pierre-Emerick Aubameyang's life was torn open again in a completely different way. Not on the field, not by professional decisions, but in the place that should have been safest. That night in Barcelona did not begin unusually. No warning signs, no sense that things were about to change, until the familiar silence of the house was broken by sounds that did not belong. Unfamiliar footsteps, unmistakable noises, and everything happened so quickly there was no time to understand. The intruders did not just take material things, but brought direct threat, violence in front of him and his family. There was no longer distance between danger and daily life, no boundary between outside and inside. Everything merged into a moment he could not control. His family was there, those he always tried to protect from the pressures of the outside world. Now in a situation he could not fully prevent, the feeling of helplessness, something he rarely faced on the field, became clearer than ever as he realized there were things that could not be solved with speed or skill. In that chaos, he was injured, not a familiar football injury, but one from a situation unrelated to the game, something he had never prepared to face. Treatment was not just physical, but a sign that the boundary between career and personal life had completely broken. The days after no longer revolved around training or matches, but examinations, recovery, and trying to understand what had happened. But what left the deepest mark was not what could be seen, but what could not be measured. His psychology was affected in ways he could not fully describe, as the sense of safety, once taken for granted, no longer existed. Home was no longer a place where he could fully let go, no longer separate from the outside world, but a space where memories of that night remained in every corner. Ordinary sounds could startle him. Silence was no longer calm, and vigilance became an uncontrollable reflex. Family, always a support, now carried a new layer of worry, as he had to face not only his own feelings but also the impact on loved ones. He could not focus only on himself, could not think only about returning to football, but had to ensure those around him could overcome what had happened. That made everything more complex, because he was not only fighting himself, but also the responsibility to protect others while trying to keep himself from losing control. The two sides within him, already existing before, now faced a new challenge. One wanted to return, continue his career, prove it was not over, while the other was stuck in that night, where nothing could return to how it was. The field, once a place of certainty, was no longer the same, because what he carried onto it was not just competitive pressure, but an experience that had changed how he saw the world. There was no simple way to overcome it, no clear moment when everything returned to normal. Recovery was not just physical, but mental. Accepting that what happened would always be part of him, he did not speak much about it, did not turn it into a big story. But the change was undeniable. The way he looked at space, reacted to familiar situations, all carried traces of an event he never wanted. And in continuing, he carried not only football memories but also the memory of a night that changed how he felt about safety, family, and himself. There was no longer a clear separation between outside and inside life, between the player on the field and the person off it. Everything blended in a way he could not control but had to accept. And from there, each step forward was not just a return to football, but an effort to regain a feeling he once thought he would never lose. After events that left deep marks, Pierre-Emerick Aubameyang's journey continued in a direction even he could not fully control when he joined Chelsea in a period where nothing was the same. This could have been a new beginning, a chance to rebuild, but instead brought a different feeling, not revival, but stagnation. From the start, he was no longer central to plans, not the name built around, but just part of a team searching for itself. Matches passed with limited opportunities, brief appearances not enough to make a difference. And gradually, the gap between him and the role he once held became clear. Losing his place did not happen in one moment, but slowly, each match missed pushing him further from the starting lineup. He still trained, prepared, waited, but opportunities did not come as before. From someone always present in big matches, he became someone on the sidelines, watching teammates step onto the field, feeling the change he could not reverse. Training no longer felt competitive, but routine, keeping himself ready without knowing when his name would be called. The shift in role changed how others saw him. From a star spoken of with respect and expectation, he became a name mentioned less, not because he disappeared, but because he was no longer where attention focused. Articles and discussions moved on to others making impact. It was not a shock, but a gradual realization that football moves, and no one holds their place forever. In long periods without playing, he began to reflect differently, not only on what lay ahead, but what had passed. Goals, trophies, moments still existed, but no longer defined him in the present. He recalled difficult phases, starting over, realizing his journey was never a straight line, but filled with breaks and turns he had to navigate. But unlike before, this did not feel like a challenge to overcome, but a phase to accept. He tried to hold on to what remained, not just form, but belief. He could still contribute, create value, even in a different role. Training became important in another way. Not for matches, but to stay connected to football, not lose what had shaped his life. The two sides within him still existed, but now less in conflict, finding a new balance. One still wanted the spotlight, to prove he was not finished, while the other accepted change, that some things could not return. He did not give up, but no longer chased everything at the same pace, slowing down, observing, thinking more about his place in the journey. There was no clear moment marking decline, but it appeared in details, not being called, not first choice, reduced playing time. And through all of it, he continued, not because he was certain of what lay ahead, but because it was the only way he knew to not disappear completely from what had once been everything. After a period of fading, Pierre-Emerick Aubameyang went to Olympique de Marseille, not as a place promising dazzling peaks, but simply an opportunity to keep going. This time, he did not arrive as a signing to change a team, nor a symbol drawing all attention, but as a player carrying experience, what remained after a long journey marked by many traces. That created a different feeling, lighter, no longer pushed forward by overwhelming expectations, allowing him to slow down, observe, and feel football in a way he had long forgotten. On the field, he began to rediscover things that seemed lost. Not peak speed or explosive brilliance, but the simple feeling of touching the ball, moving without thinking too much about proving anything. Matches were no longer places to maintain an image, but spaces to be himself. Even briefly, he still scored, still made movements that drew attention, but that was no longer central, just part of the journey. Without pressure to prove himself as before, he saw things more clearly, not only on the field, but within himself. Limits he once avoided acknowledging became clearer, not as failure, but as natural for someone who had gone through many phases. He no longer tried to be his past self, but accepted that he had changed, slowed, but not lost value. In unnoticed moments, he reflected more on what had happened, not to return, but to understand. Conflicts, mistakes, events were no longer avoided, but parts of his story. Acceptance came slowly, learning to look back without being pulled back. Life off the field also changed. Slower, less pressured, more stable, simpler. He spent more time on things once overlooked. Family, quiet moments, pauses he once denied himself. Not everything became perfect. Nothing disappeared. But how he faced it changed, gentler, less resistant. The two sides within him, once opposing, no longer pulled apart, but moved closer, not to become one, but to coexist without conflict. He no longer hid one part to protect another, no longer ran to avoid himself, but lived with all he had, strengths and cracks inseparable. In that process, he did not find clear answers to everything, but perhaps that no longer mattered. What mattered was continuing, not to achieve something grand, but to keep the journey going. Football was no longer where he proved who he was, but where he could exist more honestly, even without the same glory. His life did not become easier, but clearer, less uncertain, and in that clarity, he found a kind of peace he never had before. Not the end of hardship, but the ability to live with it without letting it define him. And in that slower rhythm, he kept moving, not to regain what was lost, but to understand some things were never truly his and did not need to be for life to continue. Looking back at Pierre-Emerick Aubameyang's entire journey, it was not a straight line from beginning to peak, but a series of turns, advances mixed with pauses, each phase carrying growth and incompleteness. From a child without a true home, moving between countries, carrying unseen loneliness, to a young player struggling in a system that did not wait, then breaking out where few expected, reaching heights few achieve. The journey had bright moments, but in those moments cracks began forming, not to destroy everything, but to remind that nothing was ever completely solid. The two sides within him did not appear late, but early, from years adapting to a changing world. silent pressures from family, proving himself quietly. One stepped onto the field with confidence, speed, the ability to create difference without explanation. A figure the world could see and interpret. The other remained, carrying questions of identity, value, whether achievements could fill inner gaps. They did not replace or cancel each other, but coexisted, sometimes in harmony, sometimes in conflict, shaping a complex journey. Success and loss did not come in order, but together. Goals, trophies, celebrated moments did not erase being forgotten, conflicts, mistakes, off-field events. They existed together, each step carrying the past. He could be top scorer, captain, hero, but also someone who collapsed in silence, left places once supportive, faced situations football could not solve. No perfect version existed, only a person with contradictions, strengths, and cracks. What made this journey special was not what he achieved, but that he never truly stopped, even in the hardest times. When form declined, roles changed, reputation faded, he continued, not at the same pace, not with the same goals, but with persistence, not always visible. He did not return to former positions, did not restore everything, but he did not disappear or abandon his path. Imperfection was no longer hidden, but part of his story. He no longer tried to prove he had no flaws or limits, but accepted them without diminishing his value. In a world focused on results, accepting the process, the breaks, became another kind of strength, quiet but lasting. The two sides within him did not disappear, but no longer opposed each other. They coexisted in a new balance, where he did not have to choose one. The player continued, even not at peak, still scoring, contributing, while the inner self was no longer ignored. He did not find one answer to everything, but perhaps no longer needed it. His life did not stop at a title, nor end at an event, but continued, with changes, unpredictability, uncertain steps. He did not become a perfect story, without a complete ending, but that made it more real. He remained, still moving, not to reach an endpoint, but to live with everything he had, what was lost, and what remained. And in that continuation, perhaps what mattered most was not that he lived two lives, but that he did not let either disappear. The story of Pierre-Emerick Aubameyang leaves both sadness and respect, showing a person who reached the top while struggling with unseen inner emptiness. From a childhood without a place called home, moving across countries, to years forgotten in the harsh system at AC Milan, then exploding at Borussia Dortmund as a top scorer, he proved extraordinary will. But at that peak, when all eyes praised him, a quiet tragedy appeared. Sleepless nights, emptiness after glory, the conflict between two selves, events like losing the captaincy at Arsenal or the break-in in Barcelona were not just incidents, but fractures forcing him to face fear of losing control of his life. The most painful part was not decline, but how it happened in silence, as a former symbol faded without full explanation. Yet his continuation, standing again at places like Marseille, even not at the top, is most admirable. For audiences in the United States, where success is often measured clearly, this story reminds that behind achievements are unseen inner battles, and a person's value lies not in never falling, but in continuing even without knowing where they are going. If Pierre-Emerick Aubameyang's story makes you think about what lies behind the spotlight, hit subscribe and leave a heart as a quiet way to stand with those still fighting in silence. Thank you for staying until the end, and see you in the next video, where we will continue exploring lives that seem brilliant, but were never truly at peace.